Good evening, everyone. Welcome to chapter 4. A little update since I last posted. I want to bring you up to speed a little bit. As it turns out, my Dell laptop, which is only about a year old, not even, is not the appropriate tool for this. So we're trying to look into another laptop so that I can actually do this video editing thing without having it crash or wait 3 hours for it just to save on my hard drive. So until then, I'll just keep trying and hopefully this thing will keep working. So here it is, chapter 4, the economic environment. Obviously, I tweaked the slides. Let's get rolling. It's a fun and interesting chapter. This is where, as I say, the rubber meets the road. We've talked about culture. We're talking about a lot of things. But once you start to analyze opportunities throughout the world, the question becomes how to assess these opportunities and what's a great opportunity. If right now you were to look only at GDP growth rate in the world, I believe Libya is the #1 country with the highest growth rate in the world. As a reference, the entire country of Libya has less people in it than Los Angeles County, just to give you a little bit of a reference point. So when you look only at market growth rate, that's a great indicator, but it's not the only thing you want to look at. Obviously, you're going to look at population, population density, etc. So your author starts us off on page 91 of chapter 4 with the economic environment. And one of the things that's one of the highlights is a global middle class market. And there's just a lot out there on that. What I found here was the latest that I found. There were a couple of really good articles from The Economist magazine, but they were older than 2016. But what I found here is from Brookings, the Brookings Institute. And so I added that here to your first slide, which this is not in the book. It's, as I tell my regular class, additional knowledge at no additional cost. That's right. So at a global level, we are witnessing the most rapid expansion of the middle class the world has ever seen. Here, the Brookings Institute is telling us that at the end of 2016, there were about 3.2 billion people in the global middle class. On average, 160 million will join the middle class annually for the next 5 years. Middle class as defined by each country, by the way. So here we have, we said about 7 billion people on the planet and 3.2 billion people reaching that. So that of course speaks to opportunities for marketing, right? Let's see if that hyperlink works for us, hopefully. And maybe kind of take a peek at some of the data over here. There we go. All right, let's bring this over here. This is Brookings right here, and what we have here is some really cool little data about the middle class, right? So here, upper, middle, lower class gives you an idea about in only 3 years, the fast expanding global middle class will reach a historic milestone. 88% of the next billion entrant into the middle class will be in Asia. I know we talked about that last time. I know we talked about how important of a market Asia is. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. The middle class will spend $29 trillion more per year than 2030. If you take that amount alone, I believe, we'll have to check, but I want to say within the top 3 economies of the world if it were a country. Let's see, the global middle class market is growing slowly in advanced countries and rapidly among emerging markets. So we haven't talked about the BRIC countries yet: Brazil, Russia, India, China. That acronym was made popular, I want to say about 10 years ago, because these are some of the 4 fastest growing economies in the world. Things have changed since then, but for sure India and China are still the 2 surviving fast economies of the BRIC. A world with more middle class people must wrestle with the implication for carbon emission. So pollution, of course, is one of the key tenets here. All right, and again, my PowerPoint just crashed. Apologies. Let's get back to it. Let's see. I know I'm pushing it. I've been told my computer is not designed for this, so we'll see what happens. Fingers crossed, people. Fingers crossed. I will try to edit the stuff out. Here we go. And here we go. All right. So going back, let's go to the second slide. Market characteristics is what we're looking at. Now, population figures can be classified to show specific characteristics of their respective markets. So for example, Northern Europe will show zero population growth in the next 30 years. Africa will triple. This is from your textbook, I believe, page 92, 93, right around there. And again, this is very telling. As you just saw when we're talking about the middle class, it's all about Asia. And what you're seeing is a lot of other countries outside the developed countries are growing way, way, way faster in terms of population. Age distribution and life expectancy correlate heavily with the level of development in the market. So something, again, to be mindful of. This is cool. Again, let's see if hopefully I'm not pushing the boundaries of my computer. So this is Worldometers info, and there you go. So it's kind of a cool, fun little website, and it gives you the kind of a current count of the global population. So we're at 7.7 billion people. It gives you the births, the deaths, population growth, but even more interesting, it gives you the top countries by population, right? So again, China and India, top two. If you look at those numbers, you will notice that India is growing faster than China by population. So estimates are within the next 5 years, India will be the most populous country in the world. And again, this is due to China's one-child policy, which, by the way, ended, I believe, 2015. The U.S., we're the third most populous country in the world at 328. So, it's fascinating because if you think about the U.S. population right now, we are still, if you think about India at 1.365 and China at 1.419, we are less than the 0.365 of India, our population, right? So in terms of people, of course, that's quite revealing. India and China, I don't need to remind you, are both located in Asia. So of course, Asia, most populous place on the planet. This is really cool. This is kind of showing you world population, past, present, future. And I mean, look, from the 1900s, how quickly things really take off, right? Anyway, so a couple of other things here about the growth rate. Yearly growth rate for yearly population growth is starting to taper down. And then over here, world population 2019 and historical. Kind of, you can see what the yearly change in percentage is. We're at 1.07. Back in the 90s, we're 1.8, in 1970 at 2, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're talking about 2% of 3.7 trillion, of course, that's huge. And then, of course, the forecasts here they are. So 2020, we're nearing the 8 billion. 8. There we go. 2055, 10 billion, and 2023, the $8 billion mark. All right. So again, some fun facts about population. Now that we've looked at population, we then look at households, right? Includes all the persons, both related and unrelated, who occupy a housing unit, right? Again, we're on page 92 through 95. I'm sorry, 95, 96, right around there. Your book has some really cool charts and graphs as well that are not on the slides. So a household includes all the persons, both related and unrelated, who occupy a housing unit. Most common in terms of household, most common one-person household are in Norway and Germany. So these two countries rank as the top countries in the world where have the most household with only one person living in those households. And then on the extreme opposite, one of the countries featured is Colombia, where commonly has 6 people per household. So obviously, for the context of this class, international marketing, this is critical information. So market characteristics, what we have here is the degree of urbanization dictating the nature of marketing tasks the company face in terms of distribution, market potential, buying habits, and in terms of income, we're looking at per capita GDP. This video is showing you a clip, again, HSBC, I think I mentioned, you know, a lot of their clips. And this is kind of like, you know, showing you what, when we look at marketing and what companies are doing out there, how to look at these households. So again, this clip really belongs with the previous slide, but I didn't have enough room. Hopefully it'll work. There we go.
Families have always looked out for one another, but with the around the world, younger generations looking to get on the property ladder need more support than ever. HSBC's Beyond the Bricks surveyed thousands of people from around the world to explore the value of home.
I never imagined I'll be asking my parents for money, especially when I'm in my 30s, but that's just the way things have turned out. But I am incredibly grateful and thankful for the support, and it's hard to put into words.
61% of first-time buyers who receive parental support would have preferred they didn't have to, of which 47% felt reluctant to get their parents' help.
I think every parent wants the best for their children, and we're no different. Raising a family is my biggest achievement, and preparing for their future is a big part of that. I'm sure I'll be calling in a few favours down the road.
One day when my daughter's going to buy her first home, I will provide financial support. So my parents did the same thing when I bought my first house. Once my daughter grows up one day, I think it's my duty to do the same thing for her.
When my parents were my age, they already had a house for a few years, and I just started saving for deposit. I think that it was easier back then.
80% of millennials think they had to or will have to work harder than their parents to own a home. As times change, the support from those around us plays an ever-increasing role in buying a home. To learn more, speak to us today.
All right, so going into income, how to you know, measure, calculate income. Per capita GDP is used as primary indicator for evaluating purchasing power. So you're basically trying to figure out gross domestic product per capita. You know, so you take the GDP of the country, you divide by the amount of people, and you basically get the GDP per person, right? So I want you to think about this before I show it to you. What countries do you think are the type of countries where people have the highest gross domestic product per person? So think about that. You can pause if you want. Here I will open the link for you, and here we go. Right, so what we have here, first it's kind of cool to look at even the map right here, right? So more than $50,000 per person per year. Well, surprise, surprise, here's the US, right? And so you look at those dark spots right there, US, right? And you know, you've got Norway, Finland, etc. You know, UAE. So let's see what we got. And of course, the very light areas are the countries where the average person was less than $2,000 a year per capita GDP, right? Very, very poor. So sub-Saharan African region right there. Let's see what we got. Qatar, Macau, Luxembourg, Singapore, Brunei. A lot of these are tax haven, but look at Qatar, $130,000 per capita. You know, that's per person GDP count. You look at the US, we're about 62,000, right? And then, you know, again, so, and this is from the IMF, this is here from the World Bank, and this is from the CIA. So a little bit different, look at the years, etc. You get kind of an idea, and then, you know, out of almost 200 countries in the world, CAR, Central African Republic, $712, not even thousands, right? Per year, per capita, right? Niger, Liberia. So these are definitely very, very poor countries, right? All right, moving along, the market characteristics, right? So income distribution, how you classify income distribution: very low family income, very low and very high family income, low, medium, high, and mostly medium. So, you know, in marketing, we like to kind of group things in different areas. I always tell students in the intro to marketing class that, especially even in advertising, People in marketing and advertising, their job is to do what your mama told you not to do, right? Don't judge a book by the cover. And it kind of, defines a little bit of marketing, right? You have a target market you're trying to go after. You understand not everyone's going to behave the same way, but you're going for it, right? And so you have these clusters, right? What we call them marketing clusters, where you're trying to group people in particular ways, and you hope you're going to be right with a lot of them. And you realize you're not going to be right with all of them, obviously. So PPP, purchasing power parity, right? So, it shows how many units of currency are needed in one country to buy the amount of goods and services that one unit currency will buy in another country. Go back to Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. And, when you think about Adam Smith talking about basket of goods, right? What the value of a basket of goods would be in country A versus country B. They have different currencies. Cost of living is different, etc. You can add anything, inflation rates, whatever. And so the Economist magazine came up with this really fun little tool a while ago. This is 2016, so this one's outdated. Let me pull up the current one, where they decided to come up with something a little bit more tangible than this kind of very nebulous basket of goods, whatever is that, And so we're going to see, in this case, what the price of a Big Mac is throughout the world, right? And there we go. So what we're doing is we're looking at the dollar, right, as a base currency. So think of the dollar as a benchmark. And we're looking at all other currencies to the dollar, right? And we're averaging the stuff out. So if you look at the bottom over here, U.S. price is an average of 4 cities. Again, it's not meant to be like a real tool that economists are using. It's more like a fun way to try to mess with the stuff and wrap your head around PPP. Switzerland is definitely the most expensive place, right? So compared to the dollar, if you went to Switzerland, that Big Mac in Switzerland is overvalued by 18% to the dollar. Norway, Sweden, same thing. What does that mean? If you want to travel to Switzerland, you will not stretch that dollar. It'll be quite the opposite. Your buying power, converting the dollar to the Swiss franc, is really bad. On the other hand, if you take that dollar and you go down the list over here, you look at Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, Argentina. Look at Argentina, negative 64%, right? So now you're really stretching your dollar, because what we're finding out about Argentina over here is, look at the currency exchange rates, right? And you end up, really, really low. There we go, 75 pesos in Argentina, 5.58 in the US, so the implied exchange rate is 13.44. The difference between this and the actual exchange rate, 37.5, suggests that the Argentine peso is 64.1 undervalued. Yes, if you go to Argentina, you can really stretch that currency. All right, so again, a really good way to decide where you're going to travel. If you want to, again, you're traveling on a budget and you want to stretch that dollar, right? All right, so that's for that. Moving along, this is a sobering chart right there. This is on page 97 of your book. So we're looking at PPP in the U.S., right? And we're looking at the population of the world, right? So in this case, you have tier 1, tier 2 to 3, tier 4, tier 5, right? And it's showing you in the world what the population of in the world makes that kind of money. So 75 million to 100 million people on the planet. Just keep in mind, this is ridiculous. Make that much, right? And then when you look at 1,500 to 20,000, 2 to 3, it's 1.5 billion people to 1.7 billion people. But here's the real sobering one, right? Tier 4 and 5, basically we're talking about anywhere between $1,500 per year at PPP purchasing power to zero, really, to less than 1,500, and we're looking at 4 billion people. That's right. 4 out of 7 billion people on the planet are at less than $1,500 a year. So most people definitely live in abject poverty. Market characteristics. Excuse me. Income figures are useful in the initial screening of markets, so you're trying to look at that. You also look at consumption patterns. Economic data and consumption patterns can be obtained and analyzed. It depends on sophistication of a country's data collection system. Obviously, very, very poor countries have better things to do than running a census or trying to figure out how much people are spending. So the data is not always reliable throughout the world. Engel's law provides generalizations about consumer spending patterns. So here's how it works, right? It states that a family's income will increase, that as a family's incomes increases, these are some things that, are his laws, the percentage spent on food will decrease. Now, some of you might think like, wait, are they buying less food? No, no, no. Remember, this is a percentage. Their income has gone up. It doesn't mean they're spending less on food. It's all relative as a percentage. They might be spending more money on food, but because they make more money overall, as a percentage, they spend less. However, a housing and household will be the same, but what they're saving and what they're spending on other purchases will go up. So what are we talking about? Discretionary income, right? For, if you remember your econ class, the marginal propensity to consume, all that stuff kicks in. All right, data on product saturation or diffusion, right, is information on the percentage of households in a market that own a particular product and allows further evaluation of market potential. So what I have, this is just an example, a fun little example. The book talks about jewelry, what countries spend how much on jewelry. Everybody has a different relationship with it. Historically, India has has been a huge market for gold, right? But because the country is so vast, as a percentage overall, it might not be as big. This is consumption of gold jewelry per capita around the world, right? So Saudi Arabia, way up there, right? Then you have Hong Kong, and you have Turkey, and you have Egypt. Again, the relationship with gold jewelry throughout the world as a per capita expenditure, this might be surprising to some of you, right? I'm just using one example, which is gold jewelry. You could apply that to all kinds of other things, right? You could apply it to, I don't know, beauty products, whatever. Market characteristics. Again, the general consumption figures must be consciously viewed as critical product form differences may be concealed. Inflation. All right, so I believe we're around 2%. Don't quote me, but, right around there. The U.S., you can look it up. We're hovering, I think we're just slightly under 2% inflation, which is considered good. I wanted to, kind of show you what an extreme this is here. So this is current. I just did a screenshot of this last night. And Venezuela's, annual inflation rate fell to 1.62 million%. Right. This is a percentage. So for those of you who are not familiar with what's going on with Venezuela, I would say spend some time, just do a quick news search in Google on Venezuela. The country's in crisis. It is very sad. This was a country that was oil rich, and for various political reasons, been putting its people through a lot. All right, market characteristics. So we're now looking at infrastructure. This is really cool. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, in fact, let me just pull it up real quick. This is kind of a little aside, but Belt and Road Initiative, right? We haven't really talked about this in this particular class. In my global business class, I know we have. But the Belt and Road Initiative, known as the One Belt, One Road, or the Silk Road Economic Belt, is basically this kind of a reinvention of Chinese economic expansion in the world, right? It's just fascinating to see the strategy that China has been undertaking, right? So again, this is going through a lot of different countries here in terms of there we go. There's two. That's perfect. So this is the two tandems of the initiative, right? Here's Beijing, and going all the way to Europe through here, and another one all the way Europe through here, right? So Africa, Southeast Asia, and then Russia, etc. So what am I talking about here? We're talking about an initiative that has to do with economic development and infrastructure. So this is a little clip about 5 giant Chinese infrastructure projects. Some of the biggest in the world are happening as we speak. All right, so definitely lots going on there in terms of infrastructure development in China. Market characteristics continued. So we're looking now transportation networks by land, rail, waterways, or air essential for distribution. So there was a really interesting story about Mary Kay. It was a case study. You guys are probably familiar with Mary Kay, makeup type stuff. Sorry, that very technical term. But it was a really interesting case study about how Mary Kay, during the last, I think around the last global recession, penetrated Brazil with its business model in the Amazon. It was really interesting to see how they were recruiting teachers, etc., to sell their product in Brazilian Amazon. Again, all that to say that poor logistics doesn't mean you can't do it. It's just a little more challenging, and it might create opportunities for the right operations of a company. So communication system for marketing include telephone, computer, broadcast media, print, internet, and wireless technology. So I have a little hyperlink here for you having to do with the leading countries in the world for internet speed, right? So maybe think about the world according to internet connection. Excuse me for that. So what do we have here? This is really a cool map to show you like the connection speed throughout the world, who's got the slowest, who's got the fastest, right? So dark blue being really screaming fast, right? So here you have Norway, 14.1 is the ranking here. They have different ways of ranking. Average internet speed in megabits per second, right? So 14.1, 15.8 for Sweden, and then 13. So Sweden is at 15.8, right? Ireland is at 17.4. One of the fastest country in Western Europe is Ireland. Ireland has kind of dubbed itself the Silicon Valley of Europe. And so 17.4 for Ireland, then we're at 11.9. So we're still, we got room for improvement. Japan is at 15.2. And let's see, Russia is at 9.4. And South Korea, 23.6. Right, 23.6. Unless I'm wrong, South Korea is still the fastest place in the world when it comes to internet speed. Again, food for thought. There's some really interesting stuff coming out of Europe with how Germany's trying to beef up its internet speed because it's losing opportunities for internet, as many companies want to kind of have service providers there. All right, let's see. The more extensive the firm's international development, the more likely it relies on its already existing support network of banks, advertising, etc., right? Which kind of makes sense. World Internet Usage and Population Stats 2019. Apologies, again, the book is a little bit outdated, so I kind of updated this. The 20 countries with the most internet users. Again, think about that. Think about that. I want you to kind of ask yourself right there, who do you think in the world has the most internet users? And obviously, that is critical information to anyone engaged in international marketing, right? And so what are we going to have here? There we go. So China is the highest number of internet users in the world. 746 million people. Remember, there's 300 plus million Americans, right? So already we got more than twice the entire American population for just China and internet users. I think I shared with you before that for all the records we have about Black Friday, China's Singles Day, you look at the records by Alibaba or Taobao, and we shrink in comparison. There's 700 million people here in India on the internet, and here we are 245 million, right? That's huge in terms of the entire population. We probably have the highest percentage, well, I shouldn't say that, but definitely 80% of the entire population on the internet is pretty good. You got to wonder what the other 20% looks like, and that's what this picture is. All right, now, okay, not funny. There we go. So, impact of economic environment on social development. There we go. So, what are the factors that impede economic growth, right? So, there are infrastructure limits. There were stories in Brazil going back, I think, about 15, 20 years about some of the highways having been funded 3 times. Now, ask yourself, why would a highway be funded 3 times? And it had to do with corruption, right? So you had some politicians take from that pot, and by the time they're done, they need to refund the highway. Labor shortages, that's a problem for China, right? So again, we talked about the one-child policy. And so what's happening for China with this one-child policy is that you are having a kind of a skewed market where a larger segment of the population is retiring, and you have a smaller segment of the population that's entering the workforce. What does that mean? Usually, when you look at social benefits, social security, stuff like that, the younger segment of the population, the working younger segment of the population, the money they put aside for social security is actually what's being used to fund the social security for the elderly. So that's a problem when you have kind of this inverted pyramid now. Demand for greater political freedom, environmental destruction, urban congestion, and the spread of drug addiction. So again, I try to do a couple of highlights here and there for you. And Iran ranks #1. Again, this is from Wikipedia, so take it with a grain of salt. But it's a good way to kind of aggregate everything. Remember, we talked about data. So this is coming from the United Nations. Iran ranks #1. Afghanistan in #2, and we're talking about annual prevalence as a percentage, 3.31 of the population. That's a huge amount of people. We're at 1% of the United States, so we're with again, population of 300 million people. That's a lot of people. But so you kind of want to look at that, and that those things will impede growth, right? Singapore, Qatar, their laws are probably some of these countries. Borderline human rights violation when it comes to how they enforce drug use. So again, a lot of give and take there. Social indicators, share of urban population as a social indicator. You're looking at your life expectancy. Let's see if I can do this quickly enough for you. This is always kind of an interesting way of looking at things. So CIA World Fact Book. And when I look at the CIA World Fact Book, I can start looking at my guide to, I think it's the guide, country comparisons. And there's a point to this. So let's see, let's click on, oops, I think I looked at the wrong thing. Oh, here we go, yes. So let's look at South Korea first of all, right? And so South Korea, right? Let's see, there we go. Last I checked, it was under S. Apologies, I should have prepared this earlier, but sometimes, you know, I get inspired to show you something at the last second, right? So, I know why. I know why it's not there. I have to look under K. Thank you. Okay. So, all right, apologize. I'll try to remember to edit some of the stuff. Korea South, Korea North. So here we go. So we are talking again about what? The life expectancy, etc., right? So when you look at South Korea and you start to look at, you know, people in society over here, right? So population, nationality, language, religion, age structure, and then you start to kind of look at some really interesting things here. So what is the population growth rate? Okay, 0.44%. Compared to the world, it's 157, right? The birth rate is at 8.3 births for 1,000 persons. So they rank 219 in the world. The death rate is at 6.3. So just try to remember those numbers, right? Death rate 6.3 out of 1,000. Birth rate 8.3. So 6 and 8 for death and birth, right? Out of 1,000. Let's go back up. And now, of course, I'm sure you know what we're going to do. We're going to look at their neighbors, right? The Korea of the North. Here we go. All right, so what do we have? Let's see. We're looking at people again. And, oops. And now we're looking at, here we go, birth rate, right? 14 births out of 1,000 and at 9.3 rates, right? The growth rate 0.5, so vastly different, right? And if you look at other things, the mortality rate, I just didn't even want to compare, but if you can look it up if you want, it's just really, again, sobering data to kind of reveal the state of affairs. All right, physicians per capita, literacy rates is another huge factor in terms of you entering a country. Your author talks about the physical quality of life index, which is a composite measure of the level of welfare in a country. Kind of making it a little bit more tangible. I'm using the Human Development Index, which is really kind of an offshoot of the physical quality of life index. So what we have here is if you look at basically statistics of life expectancy, education, per capita income, you're looking at a lot of things having to do with human development. And the dark green are higher, right? So again, so the US is up there, right? You've got a bunch of countries in Western Europe, you have Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and then the red stuff, and some even data unavailable, right? So Somalia over here, forget it. But just kind of an idea as to, what's going on. So there are rankings, by the way, in Norway, Switzerland, Australia, all these guys. Norway tends to always win on this one, right, in terms of the ranking for the highest, right? And the U.S. is not further, we moved one spot down from the previous year. So 17 to 18, we moved down one spot. And look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong went up. Anyway, you kind of get an idea, right? Kazakhstan, it stops at 58, but this is where the Human Development Index is not great, right? All right. So again, just some stuff to kind of show you some of the information out there on how we're measuring these things. The impact of the economic environment on social development. So it's composed of the life expectancy, infant mortality, adult literacy rate, some of the stuff I've talked about. The emotional well-being may be determined by the quality of social relationships, enjoyment at work, job stability, and the overall conditions of the country. There's some interesting stuff we learn in global business. For example, when you look at Sweden, Norway, Finland, they have like incredible social services, right? So they talk about cradle to the grave healthcare, free education, all the way up to PhD, whatever you want. And so if you think about a country like that and you ask yourself about entrepreneurship, for example, would someone in one of those countries be more or less likely to want to take a risk and start their own business? And the answer might be like, why? Why would I want to take a risk when I belong to a society where I'm provided for a lot of the stuff, right? And so, again, there's we kind of take some things for granted in the U.S., right? If you ever have relatives coming from some of the countries where people take a month off paid vacation and they see you working all the time, they think you're crazy, right? Again, we have, our culture looks at productivity in a different light, and it affects kind of how our quality of life ends up. All right, so let's see. This is, again, this, for those of you who took global or taking it now, this is review, right? So what we have here is we're looking at something called economic integration. 1947 to 1948, right after World War II. World War II ends in 1945. What we have is the Allies agreed to disagree on trade. They realized they had World War I, 1914 through 1918, very small break in terms of peace, and then whammo, 1939, 1945, World War II. So the Allies, in the midst of World War II, toward the end, are realizing that trade disputes are a huge cause of economic depression, which leads to other things. So how can we prevent that? And so again, I'm oversimplifying, but for the sake of time, let's go with it. The Allies come up with this plan of having a general agreement on tariff and trade. We agree to disagree on taxing other people's imports of steel, coal, textile. And what we're going to do, if we do that, we lower the price, the cost of things by virtue of not having these artificial non-value added tax. And so what we have is we create this General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which in the 90s becomes the World Trade Organization. We'll talk about that in just a bit. So what we have here, for those of you who are familiar with North American Free Trade Agreement, right? North American Free Trade Agreement is an agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Is we have a free trade amongst members. So, again, we have goods and services are freely traded among member nations. Now, if we decided to go a step above that, we could go to a customs union, where we would have a common trade policy with respect to non-members. Well, can you imagine the U.S., Canada, and Mexico agreeing to one trade policy on members outside? So we'd have to agree on, all of us, we'd have to agree on the same Chinese tariffs we're having right now. Not even speaking of Cuba and the embargo. We'd have to knock on the door of Mexico and Canada and say, hey, we want you to have the same embargo we're having, right? So that's the customs union. Moving on to the common market. So the Central American Common Market, where factors of production are mobile, so capital, labor, and technology may be employed in their most productive uses. You know what we're doing here? We're getting rid of borders, which is exactly the opposite of what we're doing right now. We're building a bigger wall with Mexico. What the European Union has today is an evolution of its economic union, and the first step was something called the Schengen Agreement, where they agreed to actually get rid of the borders. That's it. And so imagine driving to Canada, driving to Mexico with no borders. You just drive in and out whenever you feel like it. Well, that's what the European Union did at the common market level. And then finally, the economic union, again, on the outer ring here, is what the European Union has, the economic union. What we have here is the members' harmonized monetary policy. So members of the European Union who have agreed to the same currency, not all of them have. I want you to kind of, not to confuse you, but think about the European Union and think about something else called the Eurozone. And the Eurozone is a group of European Union member nations that have agreed on using the euro. Of course, the United Kingdom disagreed. They just wanted to use the pound, and now they're getting out of the European Union through something called Brexit. I'll talk about it in the next slide. So, again, the European Union was able to lower costs. Why? Well, first, we use one currency, so you don't have to convert the currency. Think about what I showed you earlier with the Big Mac Index, purchasing power parity, exchange rates, all that stuff. We're dumping all that stuff. So we're getting rid of currency. The other thing is it makes comparison of prices a lot easier, right? When you go to Europe and you go to Paris and you want to buy a can of Coke, yeah, you'll pay in euros. But what's interesting, if you want to buy the same can of Coke in Barcelona in Spain, it's going to be cheaper, and yet you're using the same currency. So it makes currency comparison a lot easier, right? And then think about the billions of dollars wasted on all the transportation and distribution, right? So these semi-trucks that have to stop at the border, they're idling, right? The drivers are not doing anything, just waiting. You have to pay for all these people to inspect the trucks, all the equipment, all that stuff. That's going to add cost, right? And so you're really adding, a lot to the bottom line, right? So when the European Union got rid of all that stuff, today the European Union is the second largest economy in the world. You don't see it in a lot of the rankings because it's not a country, right? It's an economic union, which, by the way, there's a ring missing here, and that ring is political union. If the economic union agreed to one constitution, then it would become a political union, and then it could be treated like a country. All right, so the regional economic integration is what we've talked about with the North American Free Trade Agreement, etc. Going back to what I've just talked about, one of the main economic development affecting world markets since World War II. I just told you about that. These are called trade blocks, BLOC, trade block, right? So the North American Free Trade Agreement is a trade block. The European Union is a trade block. Their leadership of selected countries, the proximity of the countries usually is a big deal. Having said that, we've actually extended trade agreements under the previous administration, the Obama administration. We ratified a trade agreement. So think about the North American Free Trade Agreement. We have KORUS, which is KORUS, which is a trade agreement between Korea and the U.S. Around the same time, we had two other ones. We have one with Colombia, and we have another one with, apologies. We have another one with, it'll come back to me. It's right there. I'm going to move on, and I'll bring it back to Panama. There we go, Panama. We have another trade agreement with Panama. So in terms of proximity, these are not near us, obviously. But so don't feel like you're restricted by proximity, right? On the other hand, the European Union, yes, they're all neighbors, right? North American Free Trade Agreement, we're neighbors. So there's a tendency to usually do that with your neighbors. Their commitment to regional cooperation is another success, right? So European integration is a result of, it results in economic growth of the EU. I've just talked about that. Eliminating all transaction costs, I just spoke about that. Economies of scales attained as production becomes concentrated. So for those of us who need a little refresher, there's just a quick way of looking at economies of scales or scalability. You know how people always kind of understand the notion that the more stuff I make, I get some kind of a discount, I get some kind of a deal. I always kind of use the idea of a factory. You have one factory and you're paying a lease on a building, right? And you're paying a lease on that one building. And you're only using 50% of the building for production, right? If you doubled output and you used 100% of the building, would you have to pay for two buildings? No, the cost will be the same fixed cost. You apply that to a lot of things. You apply that to, insurance. You apply that to a lot of things. And you start to ask yourself, to double output, do I have to double input? And the answer is no. I might be able to double output, but in this case, instead of doubling input, I can maybe jack up my input by less than half. What that means that you get to lower your per unit cost, right? And by lowering your per unit cost, you're achieving economies of scales, aka scalability. Sorry, just wanted to make sure I threw that at you because my experience is most of my students kind of like get lost with the whole concept of economies of scales. Trade blocks help markets achieve real international amazing scalability, which makes them more competitive. And then, of course, more intense competition among European companies as far as the EU is concerned. Operations from one country can be freely expanded to other countries. What I have here is a little update, right? The book doesn't have that. So this is a map of the European Union, but what's different about this map is the United Kingdom is no longer blue, right? So the UK, by the way, that little area here is Switzerland. So a little update, Switzerland is not a member of the EU. They use their own currency. Their sovereignty and independence is one of their core competency. And so here they are. So there's a lot of talk about the United Kingdom wanting to leave the European Union. Right? They voted on that a few years ago, and they're in the process of doing it right now. The law stipulated that it's now or never. So that's a problem because if you look at some of the core competencies of the United Kingdom, their financial markets are one of them. I talked about banks, etc. And so of course they don't want to lose access to the European Union with their banks, but they might, right? And so having said that, they want to not be part of the European Union, but they still want the benefits of trade without tariffs, quotas, trade barriers. And it's contentious, right? So again, that's for the European integration. So this guy's a really, really kind of right now very popular in Germany. He's one of those satire shows. Think of like the Daily Show, but in German. And this is making the news right now. So this was 2018. He's very outspoken about really being baffled about why the United Kingdom is doing this already. And it just goes. So yes, it's in German, but it is subtitled. So you're going to have to read fast. And so here it is. You can practice your German. All right. So again, a little bit of fun there. Let's see. Goal of free movement of goods has been achieved due to the move from a common standard approach to a mutual recognition approach, right? And so that's kind of give you an idea there. Levels of economic integration. So think about that little bullseye that you saw earlier, where it was reading off, again, NAFTA, kind of, So this is another representation of that, kind of showing you the United States. We have a free trade agreement. We're right here. Free trade between members, NAFTA, Mercosur, ASEAN, partial. Then you get the customs union where you agree to a tariff on all outside parties. In this case, what's different is the political union shows up, right? Remember that the EU is here, and if it had a constitution, it would be here. Again, North American Free Trade Agreement, trade between the U.S. Canada exceeded $500 billion in 2010. The ratification of NAFTA created the world's largest free market, which if you think about that, that's true, right? The U.S. is the #1 economy in the world. Add about $3 trillion to that with the Canadian and Mexican economy. There you go, or more than $1 trillion. Top 20 exports and imports between Mexico and the U.S. are in virtually the same industry, so that's been really helpful. Let's see. The levels of economic integration, again, the distinctive feature of North American Free Trade Agreement is two-side agreement to correct perceived abuse in labor and in Mexican environment. There's this thing called maquiladoras. So maquiladoras are just south of the border in Mexico. So you're talking about Juarez, you're talking about just Texas and California border, and they're factories and they make all your stuff, right? Just think about your washer, your dryer. A lot of stuff is made there, right? They make the goods and parts. Right now there's talk about closing the border with Mexico, and most experts, economists, people who are familiar with the auto industry have stated that if that were to happen, if we just decided to completely block the border from traffic, including commercial traffic, the U.S. auto industry would not be able to produce car in 3 days of that because of how interdependent we are on Mexican trade. This is a documentary.
Next time on POV.
And it's
across the Mexican border, thousands of women build the things we use every day. But at what cost?
Somos objeto de trabajo.
Watch one group of women organize for change.
Largo el camino, pero no pierdo las esperanzas.
Maquilopolis, City of Factories, only on POV.
You can watch this in its entirety on YouTube. It's there. It's an old PBS documentary, but it's a good way. I know in my global business class, it's one of the assignments I still have there. But it's just a good way of kind of seeing how this whole thing started with NAFTA and some of the uglier side effect of it that have to do with the trade on the south side of the border. So here we have, this is Mercosur, right? So here we go. Mercosur has 3 objectives. So these are the members of Mercosur. Again, I'm trying to update the book a little bit, so this is more recent stuff. Venezuela is no longer a member of Mercosur. So the dark stuff here are the full members, and the associate members are the lighter countries, and Venezuela has been ousted. They used to be a full member, by the way. Bolivia is in the process of being a full-fledged member of Mercosur. So let's talk about a trade bloc and what the benefits of a trade bloc, like we just said. One of the things you want to ask yourself is, how much of my trade, existing trade, takes place with these countries that I'm interested in being a member in? And this is where you want to ensure that you trade enough. So Chile, for example, here is Chile. Chile is fascinating because Chile really trades a lot with the US, with Europe, but when you look at its net trade, the bulk of its trade is actually not with Mercosur. So Chile wants some of the benefits of trade. Argentina currently, I just showed you with the Big Mac index, it's struggling, right? The Chilean economy has been doing really exceptionally well for years, right? And so it's kind of on standby, looking at this, going like, yeah, I'll trade with you guys, but we'll see what happens. So the establishment of a free trade zone, creation of a common external tariff system, free movement of capital, right? There's, of course, integration in Asia and integration in Africa and the Middle East as other type of trade blocs. So these are emerging markets right there. What we have is countries by GDP growth rate. We're talking about looking at the world and seeing like, where is the growth? Remember I told you earlier, Libya is going gangbusters, and so is Ethiopia. So Libya and Ethiopia are the two fastest economies in the world right now. Ethiopia, because of its new president, a really dynamic guy. It's the first time his party gets elected. There's right now a lot of hope in Ethiopia, and then a lot is happening, right? Anyway, so in terms of GDP growth rate, and this is older information, but it is really, really growing. And then, of course, you recognize this red spot right there. That's Venezuela, right? And here's the U.S., here's Brazil. Gives you an idea what country has negative growth. Venezuela, very, very dark red, and who has some major growth in terms of GDP growth rate. Like I said earlier, it's important, but it's not everything. Remember what I told you about Libya. The entire population of Libya has less people in it than LA County, right? Raising performance of the world's most advanced nations. So look at all these brands. Look at all these brands, right? So you might, Skippy, you might know Skippy. Just think about this. This is obviously a map of the world with tons and tons and tons of brands. You might recognize a lot of them, right? The more the mustard, peanut butter, Vaseline, Slim Fast, Knorr, Signal, not here, but big in Europe. Again, you get the idea, right? And so this is Unilever. It's a British company. It's a multinational corporation. And of course, in this case, Unilever has a greater footprint outside of England than it does in England, right? So it's had a really sound strategy to go outside of the country. And some of these brands, by the way, don't exist in the US and don't exist in the UK, but they've created them for their domestic market, right? So these are strategies adopted by their marketers, right, to adjust entry strategy, manage affordability, invest in distribution, and build strong brands, right? So that's what that example was. All right, gang, well, we wrapped this up. I was trying to speed things up a little bit. I hope I'm not going too fast. I know that my last presentation was about an hour and a half. I'm trying to pack it up. Pack it in 1 hour. I want your feedback. Please give me feedback either on Canvas or even on YouTube under the video. But I want to hear from you. If you're okay with this, if you can pause, you can go back. Then I can try to restrict these videos to 1 hour. And if you'd like me to slow it down a little bit, I can go back to make it hour and 20 minutes. But again, I'm trying to simplify things. So. That's it for this one, and I'll talk to you guys next time on next chapter.